Hi, everyone. My name is Angela James. I am from Louisiana. I work as a licensed professional counselor and multicultural educator, and just an overall curious being in the world. And thank you all for letting me be here with you today.
Wonderful. Thanks for being here. I'm Barbara Hebert. I am the president of the Theosophical Society in America currently, and I am thrilled to be here with all of you as well.
I want to enforce that this is a beginning for us. This is really an introduction. And even when we are done with this time that we spend together, it will still be that. It will be an introduction. There will be some unconscious that we will hopefully bring to our consciousness. And that's the beginning of our work. Part of that is understanding what unconscious bias is and how does it manifest within our community, within the work that we do, and even within ourselves. And then how can we explore ways to identify to identify how it impacts us and impacts the relationships that we have with people and how we interrelate with people. And then maybe, hopefully, we can gain some strategies once we know about our unconscious biases, gain some strategies to keep those in check or to even heighten the awareness of those. And then from there, create an action plan to hopefully deal with those biases with that heightened awareness.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about why unconscious bias matters for those of us who are walking or trying to walk the spiritual path. As seekers on the path, I think it's fair to say that we want to transform the world. We want it to be a place of peace, acceptance, and compassion. We want to live in a world where there's no judgment based on skin color, religious or spiritual traditions, belief systems, way of self-identifying, and on and on. In other words, we want to live in a world where everyone realizes the essential unity of all life and has a reverence and respect for that life. We're not talking here about including people, including everyone. Rather, we're actually talking about moving beyond inclusion, because inclusion implies that someone or something will be excluded. We're talking about a unity that is so profound that the concept of inclusion doesn't even fit. We're talking about a unity and respect for life that goes beyond love in the way that we generally think about it. Rather, we are talking about love in all capitals. Love for all beings, because nothing else is conceivable. This is the world many of us wish to live in. The difficult question is, how do we get there? How do we transform the world? Well, we all know this. We can't change other people. We've probably all tried. Change our children, our partner, our friends, our family. We can't change anyone else. The only person we can change is ourselves. And that is one of the bases for today's workshop. Changing ourselves so that we can change the world. The esoteric teachings tell us that we are all one. And we believe that, at least cognitively. It's getting it in our hearts that's a little bit more difficult. Living a spiritual life helps us to transform ourselves and ultimately all of humanity. And in order to do that, we have to be self-aware. We have to have objective self-observation. and then make the changes. Sounds so easy. But boy, it's that objective self-observation that we're really going to be delving into today that is so important, and yet so much a part of walking the spiritual path. I.K. Timney, author of the book Self-Culture, wrote, "To see things as they are, as far as it's possible, is one of the preliminary, that should be requirements, for acquiring spiritual outlook. And nothing prevents this more effectively than the presence of deep-seated prejudices and complexes in our mind." So therefore, we hold to our ethic, the ethic of the Theosophical Society, that our every action, feeling, and thought affects all other beings, and that each of us is capable of and responsible for contributing to the benefit of the whole. Many of you are familiar with Krishnamurti, Jiddu Krishnamurti. He wrote, "To transform the world, we must begin with ourselves. And what is important in beginning with ourselves is the intention. The intention must be to understand ourselves and not to leave it to others to transform themselves or to bring about a modified change through revolution, either of the left or the right. It is important to understand that this is our responsibility, yours and mine." So we begin with our thoughts. We know from our teaching, from our studies, that thoughts are energy, thoughts are things. And this energy flows outward from us into the world, impacting not just us, but also others. Thoughts that are consistent and habitual impact our mental energy field. In other words, we become what we think. So in terms of thoughts and bias, some clairvoyants have done some research, have looked at the unseen parts of ourselves, and especially the mental component, and have told us that when strong bias on any matter, doesn't matter what it is, but strong bias actually limits the mental energy field. And that then limits our openness to the higher aspects of ourselves. It slows us down in our walk on the spiritual path. When we hold on to bias of any sort, and I know you don't want to because that's why you're here, we're limiting ourselves and therefore limiting our ability to make changes. So we have a responsibility to become aware of our thoughts consciously and unconsciously. I hope this lays a foundation for the conversation we're getting to step into, a conversation that may, as Angela said, at times be difficult. But it is incumbent upon us to do this difficult work.
So this spring, we were faced with an unprecedented event with the pandemic. And just for a little while, it really forced us to all sit and really face some things that probably were already there, but just weren't as present for us. One of those is this concept of racial injustice. It's not a new phenomenon, not by any stretch of the imagination, but for some reason, because we were all sitting just a little bit quiet, something felt a little bit different for us. One of those differences was how people were feeling things that felt so unlike what they had been feeling before, even going against their everyday actions. And so figuring out what is it that was happening for us, I think that this video may begin to set the stage for our conversation.
promise me I got in trouble again at school today.
Hi, this is Miss Jones again. I'm finding your son very disruptive in class, more so than other students.
I feel like the teacher doesn't like me. Other kids do bad things, but they don't get in trouble.
He's defiant and shows a real lack of respect for any structure or authority.
I hate school because the teachers are always mean to me and I don't feel like I'm learning anything.
I'm really concerned about his behavior.
I'm always getting in trouble for what I didn't do.
We're going to have to adopt a zero-tolerance policy, young man.
School keeps calling my mother and she gets really, really mad at me.
What is going on? You'd better explain.
I feel like the whole world is just turned up against me and doesn't like me anymore. There are days I get up and I just decide I'm not going to school.
And we go to the park, like everybody's always telling me I'm not worth anything, so what's the point of trying?
I know the cops are watching us, but we just hope we don't get caught.
Your son's absences are a problem. They will definitely affect his grade point average.
I don't feel safe in my class anymore.
Should I assume you're unprepared again today?
I would always eventually get picked on by the teacher. He makes examples of me.
I feel really singled out and I just try to avoid people because every time I look, somebody's always talking about me. Oh, she's always getting in trouble.
But I started fighting more because nobody wants to hang out around a troublemaker. The only time I have real friends is when I'm on the block. So that's where I'll stay.
I'm sure you understand we take our discipline policies very seriously here at the school. What are we going to do about your son?
How often do we get the opportunity, though, to hear it from the perspective of someone who has been through these experiences? Often what we hear are the perspectives of those who are talking to that child or who are interacting with that child. And that informs what we may think about someone, and that informs what we may even feel about that individual. And so we never really get to hear what the child or the individual themselves may be thinking in some of their thoughts, in their actions, and in their behaviors. And because of that, we begin to form opinions and beliefs. But those opinions and beliefs aren't necessarily always about the behavior that we see from someone. Sometimes they actually come from thoughts and feelings that have been there for a very long time that we may or may not be aware that are there or that may be there. And that's when we come into this concept of bias. So when we talk about bias, really what we're talking about are inclinations or preferences. This is without putting any type of values, judgment on a statement, a thought, or a belief. They're simply preferences. The bottom line. I prefer sunny side up eggs over scrambled eggs. I prefer grape jelly over strawberry jelly. It's just simply my preference. I think because language does matter, we have been groomed and socialized to hear bias and automatically think of it as a bad term. And so hopefully after this, what we will begin to reshape is that bias is simply an inclination. Everyone has bias, and it, no matter who or where you're from or the most gentle being or even the most open person, there is bias that exists for all of us. Part of it is because bias allows us to categorize. It allows us to put things into little boxes in order to make sense of it. That's how our brains work. It allows us to make quick decisions, which is very necessary for us in order for us to survive. And so because of that, these biases are not necessarily good or bad. They are just those preferences that exist within us. Sometimes people will say that they are an opinion, and they are not an opinion, and they are not a behavior. They are simply these beliefs. That's how deep they are. They're deeper than opinions. They're deeper than, this is sort of what I think. No, it's much more about, this is foundationally who I am, and this is foundationally what I believe. Um, and it can be managed in such a way that it may or may not impact our behavior, but it's still definitely there. What we do have the ability to control is how our biases impact our decision making. And over time, this is something that can be changed and even eliminated. But part of that is we have to be aware of it. And some of our biases we simply are not aware of. We have no idea that they exist for us. And those biases can exist in two different ways. We can have very explicit biases, an attitude that we may have towards someone, even prejudices or stereotypes. Those are seen as biases, but we're aware of those biases. You know, it's those that we can name and say definitively. I prefer my mom's smothered potatoes over any restaurant's smothered potatoes. That's my bias. I am very well aware of that, and I am unapologetically believe that, and will sit in that, and will fight you tooth and nail if you try to tell me otherwise. But then within us, sometimes there are those implicit biases, which is those beliefs that exist for us unconsciously, really deep within us, and we don't even know it. We're not even acutely aware of it, but it's such a guiding principle to a lot of the things that we unconsciously do. And so you can have someone who may consciously reject all types of stereotypes, but subconsciously, because of those biases, they may behave in such a way that is the antithesis of what they may espouse.
I put in this slide by Marie Curie about fear and the importance of understanding, because I think it is a little frightening to think that we may look at ourselves and find something that we don't really like or didn't want to find there. And I think that's true of all of us. So it's not something to be frightened of, but rather understood. So
that's a beautiful point. Thank you, Barbara. So part of this is because we are complex beings. And so because we are complex beings, you can have two things that can exist for us at the same time. And Dr. Kinnaman, he's a psychologist. He actually developed a concept that can account for this dissonance. We have two levels of thinking that we embark on every single day in our lives. The first order of thinking, or the system one, it's our brain's fast, emotional, very unconscious thinking mode. There's no effort involved in it at all whatsoever. The everyday things that we do, driving, talking, cleaning, these types of things make a very heavy use of that type 1 system. Think of if you've ever been for a drive that you've driven continuously over and over again, and it becomes so routine that sometimes you look up and you're at home and you didn't even realize how you got there. Does that sound familiar to any of you at all? That's our system 1 order of thinking. We just sort of do it without even thinking about it. And then system 2, that's the more sort of routine, very logical, slow, effortless way effortful way of that sort of conscious thought. It's where our reason really truly exists. And so most people would like to think that it's that system two that is guiding most of what we do. But actually, it's that first system, that instinctive, I do it without even thinking about it. That's what makes up most of our thinking and what we do on a day-to-day basis. So it's that first level, that instinctive way of us knowing and being is what we are going to focus on today. Dr. Banaji, she is a Harvard psychologist. She came up with this term, implicit bias, where really she talked about this sort of system one level of thinking. And she said that largely how we interact with other people, particularly those who are in groups that are different from us, are really influenced by those sort of unconscious associations and the judgments that we make about those. So here in this video, she's going to give a little bit more detail about that.
I'm Mahzareen Banaji. I'm an experimental psychologist. I teach at Harvard University. I've been fascinated by two things. We call them attitudes and we call them beliefs. These are thoughts that are in our minds. We can't see them, we can't touch them. So how to go about measuring them is the interesting question. And for more than 100 years, psychologists have been at this task of trying to understand, trying to get out of people what their thoughts and feelings are. These particular thoughts and feelings that I'm interested in are attitudes and beliefs that we hold about social groups, okay? And how we use those beliefs that we have about the group as a whole. You know, the Swiss are like this, or the Germans are like that. How do we use those beliefs in then our judgments about individual people who happen to be members of the group? Okay, so that's the interesting question. And as I said, for over 100 years, people have been measuring them in the form of attitudes or prejudices that we might hold, thoughts or beliefs or stereotypes that we may have about different groups of people. How to go about doing this is the question. And we know one easy way to do it, and that is to ask people, what do you think about X? How likely is it that people from this group will be able to do something of this kind or that kind? What is their inner nature? Are they competitive? Are they collaborative? Are they smart? Are they not very smart? Are they trustworthy? Are they not trustworthy? Things like that. And so we would just ask. But then asking has some problems, right? There are two problems with asking people. First of all, if you ask me what I think about X, I may not want to tell you about that because that's a private belief and I don't want to share it with you. But there is a second problem with asking, and that is the one I'm most interested in. And that is that we may not know our own minds. You see, our brains do a lot of work silently, quietly. We don't have access to all of it. And we don't necessarily have access to the contents of our mind. We don't know, this may seem strange to you, but we don't know what our actual attitudes might be or what our thoughts and beliefs are. So as scientists, our job is to try to figure out indirect ways into people's minds to draw out what might actually exist there that even they may not know. So the work that I have been doing for the last, close to 40 years now is work on trying to get at the implicit or the unconscious or the less visible, even to ourselves, contents of our minds. We've developed tests like the IAT or the implicit association test, which we use to bypass, to get away from asking people what they might think or feel, and instead just trying to see what might be in their minds. So we might look, for example, at how rapidly or how quickly or how accurately you can put two things together. And the test will reveal, in a sense, what it is that might be sitting in your mind that you may not know about. So I'll give you an example just with me. I am a woman. I have worked outside the home all my life. And yet, when I take a test that requires me to associate female with career and male with home, I can't seem to do that as well as if you gave me the opposite. If you ask me to associate female with home and male with career, that turns out to be relatively easy for my brain to do. Why? I don't have this belief that women don't belong in the workplace or anything like that. And yet, my brain contains the thumbprint of the culture in which I live. And that culture has repeatedly associated female and home more so than male and home, and that's now in my head. That's the important discovery, that we can say consciously, we can say explicitly what we think and feel. That's one way in which our minds work. But there is another part of our mind where these associations that are picked up, sucked out of the culture and sit there, they're there all the time. Where do they come from? One of the things that we've been very interested in is looking at young children. How do young children come to have the beliefs and attitudes that they do? Do they learn it slowly as they grow up and so on? And our data suggests no, that children are very open to what's going on in their culture. And at a very early age, at ages like 2 and 3, we can see evidence that they have in their minds attitudes and stereotypes of the sort we see in adults. So what we now know is that these are picked up pretty quickly, and that they exist in the minds of children even at that age. But they're not always visible, but we can see them in things like conversations. So a student of mine, Tessa Charlesworth, has recently been analyzing data from parents and children. These are conversations that parents and children have had, and there are thousands of such conversations. And we can use an approach called natural language processing. We can use machine learning to look at whether in the language that parents are using, they actually are relying on these stereotypes that they have no clue that they are. When you ask parents, they'll tell you, I don't know where my child picked this up from because I certainly don't teach it to them. And yet when we analyze these conversations that parents and children have had, we can see in those conversations evidence that parents are indeed associating, for example, female more with home things and male more with career things.
So when we talk about implicit biases, I think it's important for us to start with an operational definition. Really, when we talk about implicit bias, and we've said this a number of times, but I really think having that definition to look at that we're operating from, we're talking about those attitudes and beliefs that occur outside of our conscious awareness. And I really want to hone in on the fact that we're doing this without even thinking about it. And it's completely outside of our control. And so because of that, I think setting aside if you are right or wrong in those beliefs is something we need to dispel. Because again, it's that thumbprint that was placed there when you were as young as 2 years old, as she explained in the video. And so through experiences that you may have had or things that your parents may have said to you, you have these beliefs that are just sitting there like a little stockpile that order what it is that you're doing. And they can run counter to what you consciously may believe without you even realizing it. So a little bit early, I had said that none of us are without bias. And I like to use this quote to really drive that home, because oftentimes a lot of us, particularly those who see ourselves as enlightened, we like to think that we are beyond and that we've transcended certain things. And and that's okay, and it's very wrong. We, truthfully, none of us is immune from our biases. None of us are immune from the thoughts that we may have about groups, and the fact that it's ever changing in some way based on those experiences. I think that as someone who has, been doing this work for a little while, and I've had the opportunity to present on a number of times and have even taught it to students, I still get shocked at the ways that my implicit biases continue to come up, even as I do the work around intelligence, around something as simple as hair color, around food. I mean, it's there everywhere. And we make these sort of unconscious associations about groups that are just there. It's simple as peanut butter and jelly. And we don't even recognize that. And so I think probably if I were to give you a set of words, and we've all played this exercise where if I give you a word and we do word association and you throw out the next word, what your response is guided in are your unconscious biases. So if I say black, more likely than not, what you're going to say likely is white, because those two have been put together so much that unconsciously, when we put out these words, then here are these words for us that are unconsciously coupled with them. By the same token, when there are groups, if you put up a certain group, there are going to be unconscious thoughts that will automatically come up for you, even if you don't admit them. There are these unconscious thoughts that you have about those groups. One of the things that we have been talking about is this idea of bias, but what does that look like for us? And there are, obviously in this presentation, we focused a little bit on racial bias, but there are other types of biases that do exist. One of the biggest ones is gender bias. And Dr. Banaji gave an example for her about how unconsciously, even though she's worked in her entire life and has been in a field where she is, in a lot of ways, she's the renowned expert, it's difficult for her to put working and woman together. That's one type of gender bias that can exist. Another one is this tendency for us to, in some ways, take a trait and put it towards everyone in some way, shape, or form. We even tend to elevate someone, maybe because of their job status. And so we say, oh, if they're a doctor, then that means that they are a really good person. Or if someone is a lawyer, then unconsciously we may think that, oh, they're not trustworthy, or trustworthy depending on, what's going on. But this halo effect basically says that we tend to, depending on someone's status or something, we tend to take this trait and put it to them specifically. Another one that I think is really critical is confirmation bias. And that's basically where we tend to seek evidence to reinforce what we already believe. I think a perfect example of that, if you look at news channels, if you look at MSNBC and Fox News, people who believe one way are going to watch Fox News and that's all they're going to watch. People who believe another way are going to watch MSNBC and that's all they're going to watch, and never the two shall meet. And so part of that is because they know that the beliefs that they have will be reinforced by going to those channels. And then obviously the one that we're talking about here is racial bias. And that's prejudice or preference towards a certain group based on their race. This concept of self-serving attribution, where for us, we tend to take the positive things and make them about us. And we take the not so good things and make them about everyone else. That's the goal, really, because the implicit biases, they can be changed, and they don't necessarily go away. But the goal is for once they come to our awareness, what are we doing with that when we become aware of it? And I think that this next video will actually do a pretty good job in sort of showcasing different scenarios that might happen when we become aware of some of our implicit biases.
Good morning. How are you?
Cool.
So, can we talk about how you got here?
Hey, you think I got a funny looking face? I just thought it was funny.
Hey kids, I'm telling you, go right here.
Man, we ain't doing nothing.
Go right here before I'm called cops.
So, you didn't do anything?
Nope.
Then what's all this?
Depends on who's reading it, I guess.
Well, looks broken. Skateboarding, huh?
Yes.
Is this the first time you've hurt yourself?
No, I get hurt all the time.
At home?
At home? He hurt himself skateboarding at the park.
Okay, ma'am. I'm going to have a counselor come in and speak with you.
A counselor? For what? He's okay.
Well, I done told you them tricks were gonna put you in the hospital.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, too. A nurse will be in a few minutes to help you check out.
What's up?
That doctor thought I did this to him.
How you doing?
Hi.
It ain't fair.
Fair has nothing to do with this. This is about you taking responsibility for your actions. Look, I know so many young men just like you that didn't do anything. And yet, most of them are in prison.
You don't know me. I ain't going to no prison.
If you don't want to end up in prison, you're going to have to get some new priorities and probably some new friends, too. Look, you're not getting any younger. You need to get an education so you can get a good job.
Like you? You just like everybody else. You think you see, but you don't see. You see what you want to see.
I see what's in this folder. It shows me what you've been doing.
I ain't doing nothing.
I am not doing anything. Stop!
I ain't doing nothing.
I'm not doing anything. And yes, you were. Get to the timeout chair. Now, please. I'm sorry.
One of the reasons why I like this video is because it shows that bias goes both ways. Um, I think that some people will look at the behaviors and the actions towards the young man, and there may be some thoughts about how they were regarding him. But I was also struck by how he was regarding others, particularly because we don't necessarily know the experiences that may have shaped someone getting to where they are. And so for him, obviously, he had been through experiences where there may have been some frustration or some anger that was certainly justifiable. But what do we do in terms of holding other people accountable for those feelings that we may have, and make an assumption about biases that they may have that may or may not necessarily be there, is one thing that came up for me. So the fact that implicit bias goes both ways, and the fact that none of us are immune to that and how it shapes our behavior, is one of the reasons why this video really stands out for me. So the next piece of this, as we're talking about this, is recognizing bias, and that implicit bias, namely within ourselves, because to be honest, we don't know what's walking in the minds of other people, or what is even informing those thoughts, those actions for them. And so really starting with ourselves, and beginning to identify where some of those biases may exist for us is a really great start. And then from there, making those changes to our thoughts.
Krishnamurti wrote, the more you know yourself, the more clarity there is. Self-knowledge has no end. You don't come to an achievement. You don't come to a conclusion. It is an endless river. So unpacking it.
Yeah. Once we become aware of our biases, and let me just say, this is not by any means a linear process. This is not I know what they are. Let me sort of check this box. It really is a thoughtful, engaged journey. And part of that is because you don't know what you know until you know it, and until you encounter it. And so it's once you encounter it, then what do I do about that? Part of that is being open to your experiences and changing some of your experiences. If you have a certain stereotype that you may believe about a certain group, explore why that stereotype may exist for you. I would even say, before you even move to change it, give yourself permission to think about why that may exist for you, because it could be based on an experience that's very salient for you. So think about, why is this here for me? And then what can I do to change that? The third one I think is really important, which is, let's look at people as individuals and not necessarily lump them all into one group. Look at your specific experience with them. Allowing myself to look at people as individuals and not just by the characteristics of their group was a really important part of my journey. Taking a different perspective, walking a mile in someone else's shoes, thinking about, well, what could be the cause of why they may be behaving this way, or why they are doing this. It could be based on their own experiences of being marginalized, or being oppressed, or being othered, that may be the reason why they are doing some of this. And how would I be if this were an experience or an existence that I constantly lived in? Yeah. Increasing the opportunity to engage in interactions with people who may be different from you. that takes a little bit more effort, but we are shaped by our experiences. And so I think intentionally seeking some of those opportunities to gain those experiences would be a really great idea. And then also understanding where does my cultural positioning come from, and how does it produce the bias that I have? I talked about the fact that I am a young Black woman growing up from a low socioeconomic area in the South. That is my cultural positioning. And so there are going to be some biases that come from that. And I am aware of that. How do I take that and understand that so that when I am countered with other messages, I use that to inform and begin to appreciate someone else's experience. So understanding your own cultural positioning and becoming more aware is a really critical first step. So knowing yourself is a big piece of this, and it helps you into learning to know others. Yeah. And then lastly, taking that implicit bias, that implicit association test by Project Implicit is actually headed by Dr. Banaji, who was referenced very early on in our workshop. It really is a really great way to sort of sift through this concept of bias.
And it's not just about race; it's about gender. Right. It's age. There's a whole variety of implicit bias tests that you can participate in. So, and it's great. They want people to do it because it gives information for their research.
Yes.
So, I think that one of the things that are very clear, unfortunately, is that Angela and I don't have the answers. I was hoping Angela did, but she didn't. So I'm sorry. I'm just picking on you. This is a process. It's an individual process, and it is incumbent upon each one of us to do this work ourselves. And it goes back to just by the fact that we recognize that implicit bias is there and exists in us. Not good or bad, it's just there, as Angela has said. And that it's our job to identify it, to recognize that it exists, and then start paying attention to it. Try to identify where it comes from. And that's that whole self-observation, self-awareness. And once we become aware, then we can start to make changes. So, as former International President Rada Bernier says, transformation, because that's what we're talking about, transforming ourselves, is a process that will take us, quote, from selfishness to unity. This change to realization of unity is revolutionary, fundamental. And we have got to be revolutionary in transforming the world. And that doesn't mean going out and hitting people with sticks or whatever. It means changing ourselves in a revolutionary way. I loved this quote from Khalil Gibran, and I thought it was an appropriate way to kind of pull things together. March on, do not tarry. To go forward is to move toward perfection. March on, and fear not the thorns are the sharp stones on life's path. Because we will feel those thorns and the sharp stones as we look at ourselves and as we move forward in making changes. But it is essential. Thank you all so much for being here. It's so wonderful to see and hear from you all and to be together. Thank you for spending your time with us. There's very little that's more valuable than time. So thank you. And Angela, thank you. So
thank you all so much for allowing me to come into this space. I am grateful.